Hey everybody, Dave Whitmarsh, Best Practice in HR. Today we have Michael with Korn Ferry, and we're going to talk a bit about RPO, recruitment process outsourcing. And Michael's been in the space for I don't know how many years, a while, right? So
A while,
thanks
yeah,
for the
22
call.
years.
22
Sure.
years, and I should qualify myself to some degree in saying, in a prior career at HR.com, I actually built out the RPO certification program that they have. So I know a bit about the space, but haven't put it not nearly as much as Michael. And I thought it would be maybe a good opportunity just to have a conversation of around RPO, and is it right for organizations? Is it right for companies that are looking to be a little more strategic or flexible with some of their cost? And let's go from there. So
Okay.
so so tell us, like give us a bit of your background and what you do, and that way people can have that into context as the conversation rolls out.
Sure. It, I got into the RPO space coming out of consulting, and what I found as I got a little more knowledgeable is that RPO is an awful lot like consulting in the sense that each one of these engagements that we are in is a bespoke project where the product is hiring people. Now, consulting, the product might be something else. It might be a new tool, or it might be a new process, or something like that. And then these projects, RPO projects, are run very much like consulting engagements and with expectations around productivity and so forth. So I actually started as a process consultant a couple of decades ago, and that evolved into managing implementation and managing technology. I was at Spirion, which became Randstad, and then I
Mhm.
was at Aon RPO, which was sold off to People Scout. And I was so as a People Scout for about 4.5 years, just prior to COVID. And my portfolio at that point had broadened beyond just client delivery, which is where I really started. I was responsible for global sales, strategy, product development. So I've touched just about all of the facets of what it takes to run, um, sell, set up, and run an RPO. And so it's been an interesting number of years just watching the evolution of the space and of the offering, where RPO really was in some ways people like to think it is as a more of an outgrowth of staffing, where
Mhm.
staffing contingent folks and then RPO became really the staffing of permanent folks. But it has evolved from that. I know in the early days there was a lot of thought that RPO was just going to become a commodity, which staffing is by and large, a fairly low margin. You got to have lots and lots and lots of work to make money at it, which is why there's so many huge staffing companies. And yet all those huge staffing companies have often an RPO arm, because RPO still has the ability to provide a bespoke service to a company, how they're handling their permanent hires, that just doesn't lend itself the same way to a fairly generic service that a staffing company does. And I'm not intending to put down staffing. It's a complex business, and there are a lot of people who do it very well. And RPO really still excels at being unique to each individual client. I've had, I don't know, at least dozens of clients over the years, and no two were alike in terms of the kind of service we provided, the breadth of the service that we provided, the kind of hiring that we were doing. And that's really often the case, which is why RPO continues to be such an exciting space. You and I talked at the beginning about what is the growth possibility for RPO, and it continues to be, in my mind, at or above what the rest of the economy is doing, because there still is, in terms of market penetration, there still is a lot of opportunity out there for RPOs, which is why RPOs just continue to spring up and consolidate and grow, quite frankly.
Mhm. Yeah, I found it interesting when I did the certification of where of the flexibility and the ability for some RPO providers to assimilate into the corporate culture and then to fit in the recruitment process, based off the customer's needs, right? And I'll just jump into that. So hiring for cultures, it was one of the immediate things I thought, well, man, how the heck are you going to do that, right? But really, it's not that hard, right? It's once you get to know what their culture is and what they're looking for, and so it's probably way easier to do in an RPO model than as an agency, right? Because an
Yeah.
agency just doesn't have the um, for lack of better words, the time in the office to understand what their needs are, right? And then I found it interesting how agnostic that the RPOs were in
Mm.
many cases with technology. All right, what do you
Hmm.
got? Well, okay, we can use that, or and then I found it interesting to how far they would go, right? It's from anywhere some people might just, present candidates almost like a traditional, agency, to others, like right down to background screening and onboarding.
Hmm.
Right? So,
Yep.
and I guess that's all part of the client discovery, right?
Yeah, well, that's absolutely right. You've hit on one of the key elements of discovery. It again, as part of the evolution in the early days for me of RPO, which was not too long after it really started to be a thing, clients didn't have technology that supported their hiring. The
Hmm.
applicant tracking systems were very new. They were often standalone, and not everybody had one. They had spreadsheets or whatever the case may be. And so in the early days, there was more of an opinion from the RPO. Here's the technology that we recommend, and we would install the technology and then we would operate it. Today, you've nailed it right on the head. There is rarely a company of any size that doesn't already have something that looks like applicant tracking technology tied in often with their HRIS. You think of at the low end of the scale, uh, the Zohos up through the Workdays and the Oracle HCM, and there's quite a spread in between there, and they're willing to take on any and everything. And so you have to be flexible as an RPO to come in and operate somebody else's technology. There are offerings that RPOs have in terms of technology, and certainly my company has one that's very strong. And how does that fit with what it is that you're doing? Because one of the other shifts that I saw, this took place probably maybe 10, 12 years ago, is who owns the data? That because when the RPO was operating the technology, well, okay, you get the candidates that actually get hired. Those are yours, sure, because they're now part of your HRIS. Are the other ones yours, or are the other ones the RPOs they can use for somebody else? Well, people got savvy 10, 12 years ago, and suddenly the contract started to shift. And no, anything that the RPO sources now belongs to the company very often. So it's been, again, the evolution continues on in terms of how those things tie together. But yeah, let me touch on one other point that you mentioned, the one of culture, which is so important. It's more than being just agnostic on the part of the RPO. You have to be almost amorphous, which is kind of a funny word that just came to my mind. And I see that as adaptable. On the one hand, you don't want to lose your own company culture that you exist in, because at the end of the day, it's the RPO who pays the people who do the work, even though the company is paying the RPO. Where does the paycheck come from? So you've got the culture of the company that is employing you, and you have to adopt the culture of the company that you're working for without being absorbed by it,
Hmm.
because it's often it has an impact on how you do the work that you do. RPOs, we like to think that we're more productive than in-house recruitment, and that's one of the ways that we can afford to provide the service and still make a profit, and the company is still paying less than they were paying before. And so the way we do that is certainly it's through the observation during the discovery process, and then that turns into the training. There are 3 levels of training that we go through, and this has been pretty consistent over the last couple of companies that I've worked at. You have to know how to operate within your own company. How do you fill out a time card? Where do you go for your vacation? You know, that kind of stuff. And then you have to understand the technology that the company is providing, and with it, the culture that the company wants to portray, because RPOs generally present themselves as their customer. They don't present themselves as a separate entity. That my people who are working for one of our customers don't ever represent themselves as being from my company. They represent themselves as being from the customer. And so that becomes a critical part of the training. And just recently, for example, we've had some recruiters go on ride-alongs with some of the people that they've hired to understand what it is that they do, to give them a perspective on what that job is really like. Now, a good recruiter can learn enough to recruit just about anything, I believe. Yes, there's some specialization, some tech recruiters or engineering recruiters. There's more than just lingo you have to learn. And it's really learning what it's like to work for the company that allows you to tell that story in what is, after all, a sales conversation. The recruiter is selling the company to the prospect, which is the candidate. It's a very, very interesting how we seem to be moving into a cycle of being much more personal. A lot of the AI conversation has said, well, we're going to take the people out. Is AI going to, well, you talk to any company executive, they'll tell you AI isn't going to do the hiring for us. AI might speed up our process, but they're not going to do the hiring for us. It's the people, it's being in that conversation, it's understanding that culture that you pointed out, David, that's so important to being successful in attracting, especially in an environment where still it's hard to find people in certain roles. You can't
Absolutely.
just throw up an ad and expect 100 people to apply to it today who are qualified.
Yeah. Yeah, and the job of a good recruiter is to identify who is qualified, have the conversation to see if they're culturally a fit, and then effectively, schmooze them into considering the job, right? It's a total hunt and sales job.
It is. It is. I was at a technology conference several years ago, and one of the breakouts was talking about, did we need recruiters in the process anymore? Because at that point in one of these cycles that we were going through, recruiting had become mostly job boards and text. The recruiters had gotten away from the phone, and we have come around the cycle from that, where it's that time on the phone that is so critical. Yeah, you can find the people in LinkedIn or on Indeed or through some of the other search tools, and you got to make that contact with them, particularly for these harder to fill jobs. Now, there's some, sure, the high volume positions, entry level positions. You put up an Indeed ad, and we did this recently for a facility. We put up a series of Indeed ads, and we had 500 people show up for a hiring day. Okay, yeah, that still takes place. Those are entry level jobs, and they take a certain skill set. It isn't quite as complicated. For some of these other jobs, you have to hunt them out, and you have to convince them to talk to you, and then you have to talk to them, and then you may have to convince the hiring manager who wanted somebody to be this type of person, and now you've got somebody that you think can be that, except they don't exactly look like that. So it's a sales process both ways. You're having to convince the seller to sell, and you're having to convince the buyer to buy. That's what a good recruiter is doing, is bringing those two conversations together, and doing it quickly. That's
Yeah.
the other thing, right?
I know that there's, like it really, if you were to look at the, the Fortune 100, that use some form of RPO, it's just littered, right? Like it's a good
Yeah.
chunk of them that are RPO customers. But I always thought that the real perfect fit for RPO is in a high vol or in a company that sits maybe around 200 to 500 employees that is in rapid growth mode,
Mm.
right? And I always thought that should be the ideal spot for outsource recruiting because, truthfully, by the time you get a hire a recruiter, and you're going to have to do it if you're in high growth mode, and they get up to speed, you know, your 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 timeline's already blown on getting those new hires. So
Yeah.
having
Yeah.
the flexibility of, a bunch of professional recruiters, on bench that you can just go, okay, we're going from 500 to 750 employees this year or this quarter, you know, okay, we're going to need a couple recruiters ready to go, right? And that's what I always thought that was the dream spot for, just from a business model perspective. Um, and maybe it is, right? But it just made a lot of sense to me back then.
Well, yeah, I agree with you on a lot of levels, particularly if you look at sort of the shape of the pyramid in terms of company size, right? When the Fortune 100, 500, 1,000, and how many of those have already been penetrated? And because at that next level, you start talking about tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of companies that you could be working with. What you have to overcome, and I found this because one of the things that I've done is I spent a couple years running sales. The smaller projects are sometimes harder to sell because you're asking a company, even a 2 to 500 employee company, maybe they hire 50, 60 people a year, you're asking them to spend more money probably than they're spending, maybe not correctly, but spending on a single recruiter who's overworked and hiring managers who are spending an inordinate amount of their time screening because the recruiter's just throwing every resume they find over the fence.
Hmm.
There is real opportunity there on both parts, and that becomes part of the sales process. Can you convince that company that you can make their life better while maybe you won't save them as much money because they don't have a whole lot of, their cost per hire in terms of real dollars is relatively low because again, they're overworking their recruiter. The hiring managers are doing all the actual screening and interviewing. And yet that's where the bulk of the market is. There are a couple places where RPOs just really haven't gotten a great foothold. This is one, what you're talking about, the small to mid-sized businesses. Um, the other, of course, is quick serve or large retail chains because the individual location hiring is so small, it's hard to create that critical mass. Um, Over the years, people have said to me, "Well, what's sort of the minimum that an RPO would be interested in?" I had one client where we had a recruiter and a half-time recruiting coordinator, and we hired on average 5 nurses a month.
Mm.
And they were ecstatic. They renewed time and time again. There wasn't in terms of actual dollars, there wasn't much there, but it was profitable for us. It was worth our time and worth their time. And typically, if it's not more than a couple of hundred hires, it's hard to build a model that's cost effective to the customer where you don't really have that economy of scale because even a couple hundred hires, maybe that's 2 recruiters and a coordinator. But then you got a manager that you layer on top of that, and then you got the corporate overhead that you're going to have to layer on top of that. And you put the economic model side by side, and the company says, well, why should I do that? Because I can hire those 200 people, with ZipRecruiter for $99 a month. You can't
Hmm.
really, but that's the kind of thinking that you have to overcome. So it's an interesting challenge, and I think that's why you see RPOs continue to experiment with models that allow them to address that kind of market. One of the companies I worked for, we actually had a bench of about 300 recruiters, and all they did was small projects, something like that. And so there was a collaborative, they literally could flex, literally day by day in terms of managing the cost as the demand and whatnot came in. But it's a higher cost of sale because it's almost as much work to sell one of those as it is to sell, maybe one of the
Yeah.
Fortune 1000, because the time you have to put in, the contracting you have to go through, and that's the unplowed ground that continues to have people be excited about the RPO space, where the analysts will tell you RPO is growing faster than the general economy and will continue to do so. And they've been saying that with a 5 to 10 year horizon for the last 15 years, that the RPO, of course, they're going to follow the natural ups and downs of the economy. And in general, it still is a growth economy for RPOs. And that's why people continue to work on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So when if you were to put your sales hat on, right? So and an HR person or a CFO or CEO, approached you and started talking about their issues, what would be, and I'm asking you this so that the HR people can self-reflect and go, okay, these are my problems. So what problems would they, sort of arise or talk about that would make sense for you as a RPO service provider to say, okay, yeah, we can help you. Like when does those two conversations
Yeah.
go, oh yeah, that's a good fit for us? So what would they
Yeah.
need?
There's a I won't say it's a long list, David, but there are things like, my largest client back in the day hired the RPO because they were concerned about compliance,
Mm,
and that was their driver. Often economics are a driver. I'm just spending too much on talent acquisition, and I think I can do it. I think it can be done cheaper. Um, and often those are the ones that are decentralized, and therefore they've got just these pockets of spending that they can't control. I can't find the kind of people I want. I can't find the people fast enough. My demand is very irregular. A good example of this is a client we had um, in the pharmacy space, where they had a hiring spike around August, which, if you think about the medical space, is when you want to be ramping up for open season and your
mm,
customer service people. And so they are, June, July, August, September, and then nothing after that, because of course the demand dropped off. So those kind of, irregular kind of hiring practices. And there are some companies which simply have come to the realization that hiring people is not my core competency. My competency is, building this or designing that or selling this. And I want someone else to do that. And in a lot of ways, those are often the best customers, because they're the ones who let you come in and do your thing. I came out of consulting in the late 90s, and it was often a joke that you hire a consultant to tell you the time with your own watch, right? And the most difficult clients were the ones who would hire you and then would tell you how to do it. And that's the
mm,
same thing today with RPOs. The most difficult clients to be successful with are the ones who hire you because they think that's the right thing to do, and then proceed to tell you how to do what you need to do. And my approach to those kind of conversations is, tell me what your problem is. Don't tell me what the solution is. Tell me what the problem is. Let's look at the problem and figure out how to solve the problem, because that's what I'm here for. I'm here to solve your problem. And so those are the kind of, what I translate to your question, those are the kind of buying signs you're looking for. Is someone expressing a problem that you believe you have a solution to, and that they're going to be open to a solution that you have, And there are different vectors that can come in on. I have seen deals where the customer doesn't pick the lowest cost provider. They pick
Hmm.
the provider they think that's going to give them the service they want. On the other hand, I've seen deals where it all goes into an e-auction, and it's all about whoever puts the lowest number into the system. I dealt with one client where the business would negotiate with the different people. They had to RFP every 3 years, and so we had to renew every 3 years. The business would negotiate, and then they go to procurement and say, "This is the one I want," and then procurement would then negotiate the price. And if the
Hmm.
procurement couldn't get to the price that they thought they should be paying, procurement would say, "No, you can't have that provider. We're going to pick number two." All those things exist in the marketplace, and the savvy salesperson is listening for those kind of buying signs and can be in that kind of a conversation in the meeting the person in the moment that they're in, because that's what sales is all about, right? It's a truism. The guy who was my best man is a sales guy, has been his whole life, and actually wrote a book about sales process. And his one of the things that he talks about is that you don't ever sell anything, people buy. And what you have to do is you have to make it compelling to buy from you, not because you're able to sell them. The person that you sell on something is probably not going to be a very good customer, because somehow they're just giving in to you as opposed to they're making an informed, conscious decision on their part. So it's an interesting dance to see all these things weave together. But you got to look for the buying signs. That's what I'm saying, and it'll be different for everybody.
One thing that I really found fascinating when I was in that space, and part of my job to build out that certification program, well, truthfully, was to understand how the certification program worked, because we were rolling out 21 of them at the time, and I wanted to sort of understand what it was like so that I could hire people, to do it. And we ended up hiring 21 folks to manage each of those. I guess 20 because I did one, but I I found it really interesting that of all the areas of human capital, that I've experienced over the years, it was never hard to find a good ROI or customer success story in RPO. And and I, when you really look at that, right? So
Yeah.
that to me was like one of the hardest things to imagine, because it wasn't like, "Oh, we did this ourselves, we did whatever." It was like the company's basically saying, "We found somebody that could do the job better than us."
Mm-hmm.
And that's a bit of an ego pill for some companies to swallow, but
Yep.
I never had a problem finding those studies, or people, having me interview their customers, or wanting customers on advisory boards or in webcast, or it was really shocking how uh, like I personally, although I do own a company, certainly not one that's, ready for an RPO, but I would think that that would be something that I may not want to be overly public with if I had 10,000
Yeah.
employees. And they had no hesitation. So there must have been a great ROI, improved service, or something that happened as a result of it in order for
Yep.
them to speak about it.
Without naming names, at a client, we took their average time to fill from 44 days to 27 days over the course of 9 months. That's the kind of thing that drives people to recognize that RPO is a great tool. I think that when you really get down to it, the key things that RPOs do fundamentally better than even a large in-house hiring organization is productivity, because we don't go to all the birthday parties in the coffee room and stop at the water cooler to have a conversation. So there's just some inherent productivity that goes into it. Generally, the training is more intensive, and um, I guess I want to say quality. It's more appropriate, and then the RPOs can often also take advantage of salary arbitrage, which a company may not be able to. You know, if you've got offices in Chicago, New York, Atlanta, and you're trying to put people in those places because that's where your offices are, you're just going to be paying more for the same resources than if you're an RPO and you have people who are very happy in North Dakota, or you know, somewhere else where there's a lower cost of operation, or have the ability to have a footprint outside the United States where the cost differential is even greater. Those kinds of things come up, but I really think at the end of the day, it's the the happiness factor, which you were alluding to, really comes from the ability for the RPO to be much more concentrated and really be the experts at what they need to do. Where, you know, even if you're if your job as a recruiter in house, you're going to get tapped into other things. They're going to be company projects. They're going to be other things. Are you really going to be an expert? Are you? The companies that manage to do this successfully internally these days tend to be people who hire former RPO people to
Interesting.
to set up their organization and then to run it. And then they run it like an RPO where it's standalone, it's centralized, or you know, the knowledge is concentrated. Um, we did a town hall recently, and we had some recruiters talking about what it is that they do and why is it that they're recognized by the customer as being great recruiters. And it's things like knowing their space and coming prepared to the meeting and having the tools that they need to be successful. And that's what an RPO does, because that's our business. That's so we make that stuff easier. I'm not saying you can't find that stuff inside a company. It's a little harder. It's a little harder to
Right.
find. You might have to work at it. You just, you know, you might be a cog in the machine that doesn't get paid attention to. There are all those kinds of things that go on. But um, I agree with you that it's not hard to find great success stories. And yeah, you find some disasters. There have been some really notable ones that literally have almost taken down an entire company because they were such a large disaster jumping in on a. There's one in healthcare several years ago that just it blew up within about 6 months, and it almost cratered the RPO that was working it. They managed to regroup and refocus, but it was just, you know, 300 people laid off, just really ugly because
Hmm.
they weren't prepared for what the client wanted to have done and any other kinds of reasons. So, you know, I'm dealing with what was in the public sphere, where I was competing against them. So it is possible to meet things. We had a deal we sold, and we were up and running. We hit the 90-day mark. They hired a new CHRO, and he fired us 2 weeks later. We weren't doing anything wrong. He just didn't like outsourcing.
Yeah.
That just wasn't what he thought was going to be successful here for his company. Sometimes that's what it is, opinion. And okay,
Hmm.
I get it. I get it. You know, can you show data that it's going to be better? Maybe not, but maybe that doesn't matter to people. You know, it, that's why there isn't 100% market penetration. That's why that there still are
Yeah.
opportunities, and there are opportunities with companies where there hasn't been success in the past. People get tired of the same RPO and they pick a new one. That happens too, or they throw them out and then they bring them back in. There's all that kind of movement, which just keeps it exciting.
No, totally. Well, and like you say, the predictions are it's going to continue to be a growth
Yeah,
space for the next time. So, you know, there's so much to it and so much nitty gritty and details and things you want. But I really, you know, if I sort of look back, I think that the flexibility, you know, governed by a good procurement contract, right? Like you guys must
mm,
hate when procurement gets in if they start, you know, nickel and dime altering the contract and stuff like that. That's where, yeah, that's where your gravy can be taken away from the deal, right?
yeah,
And even though it's still gravy, it's still probably better than what the company was paying for. But procurement or good financial eye can trim
yeah.
some of that. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I totally hear you. We would joke about, you know, there's a procurement school that they go to that no one else knows about, and there are procurement manuals that no one else has visibility to. Um, And I think back. I renegotiated one client, renewed one client, and the contract was 700 pages long. We
Mm.
had 15 meetings. It was renewal, right? We had 15 meetings of 3 to 6 hours each, hammering out, going through every single clause, this and that. And at the end of the day, it was the simplest contract in the world. We had two rates, one for hourly, one for management, with a sliding scale based on volume. And all the rest of it was just governance,
Mhm.
SLAs and payment schedules, and what do you do about foreign exchange, and how do you have to vet your people. But it was actually one of the simplest contracts that I've ever worked with. You had two rates, that was it.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it was 65,000 hires a year, so it everything sort of smoothed itself out. But you can get a really complex contract that really doesn't govern anything. That's the other thing. And so, I mean, I hear you. There's no such thing as a standard contract. I actually did a project as a consultant years ago where I helped a company write their standard statement of work, just to put in as many of those things as you were talking about. Not so much the gravy, but the protections that would allow the RPO to actually exercise themselves and ensure that they were being paid for it. I mean, they had a clause that said that that you paid the invoice after 90 days, after somebody had been employed for 90 days, and if they weren't employed for 90 days, you didn't have to pay them. What is that? You're working for free.
Mhm.
It's you did the work. Now maybe you can have some KPIs or some SLAs that govern what happens on the backside if people don't work out, and they don't, and having an attrition KPI is not unusual. Man, you got to make sure you're paid up front somehow. Otherwise, you're going to go out of business, right? Where you're paying people to do the work, and then you're not getting paid because somebody quits after 89 days, not because you hired the wrong person, but because they had a terrible boss. What are you going to do about that?
Yeah.
All those little you you got to watch out for all those things when you're an RPO. There's a lot of subtlety to it in terms of making sure you don't get boxed into something that you can't deliver on. That's
Yeah.
always a challenge too.
Yeah. Well, and it really comes down to having some good conversations, right? And
Yeah, it does.
expectations. And
Yeah,
really, if you can, I've always said it, if you can come up with proper expectations on anything, then nobody's selling anything. It's just a good mutual partnership, right?
right.
If the
That's it.
Yeah. Well, this is awesome. So I'm gonna leave it up to Michael to, give me a bio and whatever he wants to talk to about this, and if he's interested in being connected with, if anybody has any questions. So he'll and that's of course below what you're watching right now. So, feel free to ask some questions and look into it. If it's right for your organization, um, and then definitely explore it. Don't be afraid of it. Like I said, there's tons of case studies out there that shows it's the best thing that people have done when it comes to recruiting. So
Yeah, I think it's an opportunity for virtually every company. It is something that you have to consider. You may not see the fit today, and there's a lot that an RPO can do for you that you probably can't do for yourself, and you may just not even realize that. That's what I would say to people. And I'm happy to connect, and I'll share with you a bio, Dave, and we can put that out there. Happy to connect with anybody who wants to talk about RPO or anything else. Always open to that.
perfect. Well, good conversation. Appreciate it, Michael.
It was. I appreciate it. It's great way to spend a morning.